Hello and welcome. Hi. Got a couple people walking in here. Hi, welcome to the YDSA, the Young Democratic Socialists of America, and our first ever speaker presentation here at Kansas State University. My name is Daniel, and I am one of the co-chairs here at the YDSA. I've been working as hard as I can along with the many of our team members to make sure that this event is possible and that we could get Dr. Rockhill here to this campus. So I just first wanted to give a great thanks to all of the folks who have volunteered for this event, who have worked on our team and worked hard to make sure that every step of this process is as clean and as finished as possible. So thank you to all of them. Next, I want to thank the Student Governing Association for providing the funds for this event. They were the ones that made it possible for us to be able to invite the speaker here, as well as be able to put on this event so that it can be free for all of you to attend. So thank you again for that. With that, we will have Nick, our other co-chair at the YDSA, introduce our speaker.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Nick McKee-Rice. I'm the other co-chair with the YDSA. I want to thank everyone for coming out today. I also want to thank Dr. Rockhill for joining us today to share his insights on the rise of fascism and the failures of liberalism. This is a crucial conversation to have right now, just not in theory, but also in practice, as this moment demands clarity above all else, as well as action. Many of you have probably already seen some initiatives that the YDSA has been doing, like our Plan B, Free Plan B and Free Narcan actions, our advocacy for Palestinian liberation and trying to keep ICE off campus. We've been organizing for justice in all forms. Maybe you've passed along our tables that happen in the union every week for the countless hours that our members do, almost spending too much time and not focusing on their homework. But none of this happens without the support from our community. Every campaign, every action, every flyer, every infographic is possible only because of the broader K-State community. By showing up today, signing our petitions and reposting our infographics, even the kind of janky ones, you've already taken a huge step. But now I'm asking for you guys to do one step further. Follow us on Instagram, fill out our interest form, join our meetings. It is a big step right now, I know. But we are not that scary. I know our politics, socialism is a big word for a lot of folks, but we have a friendly faces here, right? We have food at our events, stuff like that. I am asking you guys to join us. I will be honest, we are organizing at a time when the threat of fascism is escalating, not as some fringe movement, but as a reaction to the deep crisis within our political and economic systems. When people lose faith in the systems that only serve the rich, it fosters a groundwork for fascism to breed. That's what makes this moment so urgent. If you don't understand fascism as a product of capitalism in decay, if we treat it as some random glitch rather than a feature of the failing system, we risk repeating history. That's why I am so grateful to have Dr. Rockhill join us today. As a philosopher, writer, founder of the Critical Theory Workshop, he has helped expose the deep ties between liberalism and fascism and challenges us to think what liberation truly looks like. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rockhill.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's a real honor for me to be invited to Kansas State University. I've been invited around the world to many prestigious places. I've been in Barcelona, I've been in Buenos Aires, I've been in China, but this is for me the greatest possible honor because I grew up in Kansas on a farm not far from here. And one of my sweetest memories of my life, I'm starting out light because it's going to get dark after this for the discussion. So one of my best memories is I moved to Paris, must have been 25 years ago. I was able to get a scholarship after my undergraduate studies, and I didn't know anyone there. I barely knew the language, but I knew one person who was a friend of a friend with whom I'd worked construction for about 6 years in rural Kansas, including at the Pony Express station in West Kansas, and a number of other kind of historical sites. And he said, I went to K-State with my good friend, Eric. He lives in Paris, go and meet him. And so I wrote to Eric. Eric said, yeah, just go to this cafe, wear an orange shirt. And I was a bit of a hayseed, but I did have an orange shirt, and I went and I met him, and he picked up this little hayseed from Kansas and got me an apartment, introduced me to wonderful people, set me up, taught me the ropes, taught me how to buy a suit, how to wear a suit. I got cleaned up, got educated. And so I have an eternal debt to Eric, and via Eric, Kansas State University. It's a real honor to be here. And the topic for today is something that I've been working on for quite some time because I think it's integral for all of us to understand what fascism is, where it comes from, and most importantly, how to fight it, and what the fight looks like when you don't just win it in the short term, but when you win it in the long term. And part of what I'm going to present is the opening section to a book that I've been working on called, and don't be scared of the title, Fascism and the Socialist Solution. The opening comments are going to be somewhat of a conceptual nature. There was someone here earlier who was joking about me citing Hegel or maybe getting all philosophical. There is a philosophic component, but the reason I want to start with this is because of how strange the concept of fascism is and how it tends to operate to obfuscate the actual material reality of fascism. So the concept of fascism, as it is commonly used within mainstream discourse, functions in the most singular fashion. When the question is raised if such or such phenomenon is fascist, it is considered perfectly natural to compare it to the supposed touchstone of fascism, which is taken to be the form that it took in Italy and especially Germany. Paul Sweezy described the situation as follows, quote, "For a political system to qualify as fascist, it has to display the German or Italian characteristics of fascism. It must be based on a fascist mass movement anchored primarily in paramilitary formations of brown shirts or black shirts. It must be a one-party regime with a party headed by a Führer or some other figure symbolizing the principle of authoritarian leadership. It must be violently nationalist, racist, anti-Semitic. It must be frankly illiberal, intolerant of opposition, hostile to civil liberties and human rights." This is quite obviously the standard yardstick. So we ask questions like, well, are there swastikas, goose steps, and Nazi salutes? There are Nazi salutes, by the way, but this ends up being the qualifying attribute of whether or not something counts as fascism. There are more or less extreme versions of this approach. Some of them focus specifically on Nazism as the ideal type of fascism, whereas others concentrate slightly more generally on a classical model of fascism found in Italy as well as Germany. The essential conceptual move, though, is identical. It is the particular historical manifestation of fascism that is supposed to define the general and not the other way around. A specific manifestation of fascism is assumed to serve as the touchstone for judging whether or not fascism exists in a particular instance. Now, we should take a moment to register how strange this is, because other political concepts don't function in this manner. It becomes readily apparent if one thinks, for instance, of a category like revolution. Would it be appropriate to draw the conclusion that an uprising is a revolution if and only if the same fundamental pattern it follows is that of the French Revolution, for instance? Should one specific revolution serve as the touchstone for all revolutions? The absurdity of such a proposition becomes obvious if you consider a widely used political concept like that of a state. Should we restrict our use of the term only to those situations that resemble a particular state, such as the United States? What about the category of dictatorship? Can the concept of colonialism refer only to the model of French colonialism in Africa? Now, a likely criticism of this line of argumentation, or what's implicit in what I just said, is that the concept of fascism emerged in Italy to describe a novel form of politics, and it therefore makes sense to consider it as the prototypical exemplar of fascism. It is certainly true that this is where the concept emerged, but it is highly significant, as Benito Mussolini himself regularly insisted, that it first appeared as an inchoate, disorganized movement that was only later and awkwardly conceptualized. Fascism in Italy was an evolving project that changed very significantly over time. The practice was primary, and its conceptualization followed in turn, meaning that there was not a predefined idea of fascism that determined the practice, but rather a shifting series of activities that were later conceptualized as fascism. When the term emerged, it was strongly affiliated with Italy, to such an extent, in fact, that the Nazis themselves often referred to the fascists as people distinct from themselves, meaning the people in Italy. By contrast, the Nazis called themselves National Socialists, abusing the term socialist, by the way, which we could come back to in the Q&A. In 1934, Joseph Goebbels wrote in Fascism and Its Practical Results, quote, "Mussolini stands at the beginning and at the end of the political development that we call fascism. Fascism is a phenomenon that entered the world of phenomena for the first time with Mussolini. Fascism received from Mussolini not only the idea, but also the shape and organization. Fascism in this sense," let's end quote, "fascism in this sense was understood as a proper name. It stood for the unique form of politics implemented in Italy under Mussolini. In Mein Kampf, Hitler also used the term fascism in this manner to refer to political developments in Italy. But at the same time, Italian fascism clearly exercised an important influence over German National Socialism, and Goebbels recognized this. He described this in terms of a confluence between them insofar as they're both driving in the same direction. Quote, "I'm firmly convinced that the political direction that we today call fascism in Italy, and which we call in Germany National Socialism, will gradually penetrate the whole of Europe. That there can no longer be any inhibition or obstacle to it, and that the future of our continent depends on the breakthrough of this political phenomenon," end quote. He is here identifying a common practice behind two different national movements affiliated with the concepts of Nazism and fascism at the time. It is this common practice that would be conceptually identified with the term fascism. Rather than simply functioning as a proper name, tethered to the specific type of rule in Italy under Mussolini, the term was given its conceptual birthright by being elevated to the status of a genus with multiple species, right? National Socialism and Italian fascism being species of the genus fascism. In this regard, it is important to note that at the same time, there was a clear identification of movements around, or I should say across the capitalist world, that were recognized as fascist in this sense, including, very importantly, if you look at the mainstream press in the United States in the 1930s, the Ku Klux Klan, which was identified as being an American version of fascism. So even though the term fascism was minted in Italy and it originally functioned as a proper name to refer to this unique phenomenon, it became a concept by being recognized as a more general category that could be applied to other instances. In the 1930s, the communist movement widely used the concept of fascism to refer not only to Italy and Germany, but also to similar reactionary political movements across the entire capitalist world. There were fascist movements in every capitalist country in the wake of the Great Depression. Figures like Antonio Gramsci, Togliatti, Dutt, and many others used the concept in this sense. Nazism, by contrast, largely remained a proper name, used to index the specific form of fascism in Germany and those who identified directly with it, including, of course, after the war. In other words, fascism was broadly recognized as the genus of which Nazism and Italian fascism were but species. With all of this in mind, we can now return to the common sense understanding of fascism in the contemporary world. What is remarkable is that at least when the term is invoked to discuss developments in the capitalist world, the category of fascism is often deprived of its conceptual power of generalization because it is collapsed into a particular instantiation thereof. Such particularization renders the concept ineffective since, at least in extreme cases, it simply becomes a matter of studying how a specific phenomenon measures up to a particular ideal type of fascism. Rather than Nazism and Italian fascism being recognized as specific manifestations of a more general phenomenon, fascism, they become the universal form by which all potential forms of fascism are judged. The relationship between the particular and the universal is thereby inverted. Rather than the particular being subsumed under the universal, it is the general that is subservient to the specific. So the very idea of fascism is thereby deprived of one of the major features of concepts in general, their ability to concretely abstract from empirical particulars to identify patterns at a higher level of generality. Without this power of concrete abstraction, a concept is reduced to little more than an empirical description of one particular phenomenon. It's quite literally deconceptualized. It has no power as a concept. It instead comes to function more like a proper name that indexes a singular reality. Instead of fascism functioning like other political concepts, by identifying general patterns, it comes to function more like a proper name organically linked to one particular social phenomenon. Right? To simplify this, it would be, well, somebody's a Nazi because they give a Nazi salute, or somebody's a fascist because they have a swastika tattooed on them, but you couldn't recognize someone as a fascist if they do not have those particular attributes. The conceptual reduction of fascism to the proper name of a particular is also visible in one of the other tendencies within the mainstream conceptualization of fascism. If it is invoked to refer to developments in the capitalist world above and beyond the Nazi fascist exemplar, it is most often used as a form of moral or political condemnation of an individual, such as Trump, Orban, Musk, Bolsonaro, rather than as a critique of the system that produces such individuals. A single person is thereby judged to be fascist, usually based on the Hitler-Mussolini model, but this again singularizes the concept of fascism, depriving it of its power of generalization and its ability to describe a system of governance within which individuals operate. The overall ideological effect of the particularization of the concept of fascism, which destroys its power of generalization by reducing it to a proper name, is to impose the idea that fascism is a singular aberration within the capitalist world. If this unique phenomenon reappears, it primarily rears its evil head in individuals, not the system that produced them, once again promoting the assumption that fascism is an exceptional development. The next section of my talk is totalitarianism, or the ubiquitous affiliation between fascism and communism. I didn't realize that the color was appropriate, so, but I'm glad I brought that water bottle. So the ideology of fascist exceptionalism, that's what I've been describing. The ideology of fascist exceptionalism primarily applies to the capitalist world, and more specifically to the imperialist countries and their allies, the leading capitalist powers, Western Europe and the United States. It implicitly suggests that the abhorrent violence of fascism only manifests itself in the imperialist world order in the rarest of instances, and perhaps only once in history, or only through the nefarious effects of diabolical individuals. Capitalist societies involved in imperialism are thereby depicted as structurally devoid of fascism, at least for the most part, and the latter is presented as a rare disease that has only infected a few aberrant societies or individuals. The ideology of fascist exceptionalism thereby goes hand in hand with the assumption that fascism is an irregularity within the capitalist world and a radical departure from its normal functioning. By contrast, there has been a powerful ideological effort to use the concept of fascism in the opposite sense when it comes to socialist countries, generalizing it to the utmost as a characteristic of most, if not all, societies that have sought to liberate themselves from capitalism. The master concept that has played a major role in these ideological endeavors is that of totalitarianism. This concept was originally used by communists to describe the totalitarian control of workers' lives under capitalism. However, in the post-war era, figures like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Hannah Arendt attempted to redefine totalitarianism as a general conceptual category that applied equally to fascism and communism. This was part of a larger psychological warfare campaign on the part of imperialist states to redefine fascism in such a way that it was seen to be a feature of communist societies. Brzezinski and Arendt had ties to the US national security state and the national security state of the United Kingdom, and they were involved to some degree in academically laundering state-driven propaganda. Here we arrive then at the central paradox of the common sense use of the concept of fascism. Whereas it is treated as a singular aberration within the capitalist world, it is judged to be ubiquitous in, or even a constitutive feature of, the communist or socialist world. It is singularized to such an extent that it all but disappears under capitalism, whereas it is generalized to such an extent under communism that some major Western analysts, like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer of the Frankfurt School, have claimed that fascism and communism are simply the same thing. Slavoj Žižek has recently continued this trend by drawing on the dubious scholarship of the eugenicist A. James Gregor to assert that post-Deng China is a variant of contemporary fascism. This process of conceptual overgeneralization not only applies to communist countries, but it also includes nearly any strong state that resists imperialism. To take but a few examples, political figures like Saddam Hussein, Omar Gaddafi, and Bashar al-Assad have regularly been compared to Hitler, thereby suggesting that they were the leaders of modern-day Nazi states. I've never encountered a mainstream discourse that applies the ideology of fascist exceptionalism to countries like Iraq, Libya, and Syria, meaning a discourse that cried foul and claimed that the comparison is absolutely illegitimate because the fundamental features of the Third Reich were not present. There weren't swastikas, Nazi salutes, etc. The same is very much true of the condemnation of communism as fascism. Have the ideologues of empire ever held their analysis of communist countries up to the same standard as capitalist countries, when it's a matter of comparing them to the touchstone of Nazism and fascism? And have any of them claimed, for instance, that Poland and Czechoslovakia did not share essential characteristics, or that more generally, their anti-colonial, anti-capitalist internationalism inexorably separated them from the colonial capitalist ultranationalism of fascism? We see here, and this is my basic point if I lost you at any point in what I just outlined, that the mainstream dominant concept of fascism is radically lacking in analytic rigor and in the power of conceptual generalization. The next section, which is very short, is fascism and imperialism. Here we arrive then at the heart of matters. The ideology of fascist exceptionalism seeks to render fascism a complete anomaly in the imperialist world order, thereby conceptually severing fascism from imperialism. The ideology of fascist overgeneralization aims at making fascism ubiquitous in the regions of the world that resist imperialism, the most significant of which are the countries that are building an anti-imperialist socialist world order. The bourgeois ideology of fascism thereby turns the world completely upside down, making fascism into a characteristic of anti-imperialist resistance rather than a fundamental feature of imperialism. This ideological inversion goes a long way to explaining how the dominant concept of fascism functions as a term of condemnation. The fascists are those to be morally condemned for resisting the global order of the so-called free world, meaning imperialism. They are, in short, our enemies. This bourgeois ideology of fascism was cemented into the bedrock of US-American ideology through the myth of the good war. It is to this foundational ideological historical narrative that I'd now like to turn. So this is the title of the next section. So the United States emerged from the Second World War as the undisputed leader of the capitalist and imperialist camp. The former imperialist powers of Western Europe had been destroyed by the war. Its founding legend has been insightfully diagnosed by historian Jacques Pauwels in a book entitled The Myth of the Good War. There are a number of facets to this mythology, but the core belief is that the United States is an anti-fascist defender of democracy and freedom, whose mission is to support the so-called free world. It thereby arrived as a leader on the world stage under the banner of the defeat of fascism. Its culture industries, which are the most powerful in the world, have put all of their ample resources into spreading this message far and wide in an attempt to guarantee that the United States took the helm of global imperialism under the guise of being the greatest defender of democracy that the world has ever seen. The ideology of fascist exceptionalism within the imperialist world order was integral to the myth of the Good War. By cementing the idea that fascism is an anomaly within the imperialist world and that it was defeated by the fearless guardian of democracy, it established a bedrock narrative, according to which the world order overseen by the United States was founded on the defeat of fascism and the victory of democracy. This is one of the reasons why there has been a very strong tendency within mainstream discourse to resist the use of the category of fascism when analyzing the imperialist order governed by the United States. It couldn't possibly be fascist because the United States became the leading world power through its world historical defeat of fascism. The ideology of fascist overgeneralization, which applies the category indiscriminately to communist countries as well as other nations that resist imperialism, has allowed the United States to further develop its founding narrative in terms of an ongoing fight against fascism. The Nazi designs of an evil empire were quickly followed by the Soviets and now the Chinese, according to the dominant narrative. The message is clear. If fascism exists in the world, it is to be located in the anti-imperialist movements, particularly those that pose the greatest threat because they have a universal and international project of anti-imperialist liberation. In this sense, the myth of the Good War is the founding legend that consolidated both the ideology of fascist exceptionalism within the imperialist world and the ideology of its ubiquitous presence in the anti-imperialist world. Now, to be sure, the United States entered the war, World War II, on the side of the Soviets and contributed to the defeat of the Nazis. Some 400,000 US soldiers gave their lives fighting Nazism and fascism, making decisive contributions in Western Europe and Japan. If we were to use the vocabulary of Antonio Gramsci, we might say that there is a kernel of good sense, meaning a grain of truth, within the common sense narrative regarding the United States anti-fascist orientation. However, this needs to be very seriously contextualized. The overwhelming majority of the Second World War was fought in the East, with some 27 million Soviets and 20 million Chinese giving their lives in the fight against fascism. They were the ones who deserved the greatest credit for defeating it, and many of them were self-declared communists. The United States entered the war very late and in an opportunist manner, with an eye to the spoils of war after it was clear that the Soviets were routing the Nazis. Moreover, it had not at all resisted the rise of fascism in spite of innumerable opportunities, such as during the Spanish Civil War, or when Stalin beseeched US American leaders on numerous occasions to enter into an anti-fascist alliance. The US national security state also began cozying up to Nazi and fascist elements before the official end of hostilities. This is very well documented through internal documents that are available through Freedom of Information Act requests and in various archives that I've consulted. After the war, the United States established a veritable fascist international, integrating, and I know this might sound surprising to some of you, but it's extremely well documented. I have a number of articles on it with myriad references, many of them archival, but there's also a lot of great historical scholarship. The United States integrated tens of thousands of fascists, these are from Italy and from Germany, into its ranks, and many thousands more in a global empire. In doing so, the United States did not publicly declare itself to be the Fourth Reich. On the contrary, it has done everything in its power to maintain the narrative according to which it is the greatest defender of freedom and democracy. Its mobilization of fascist forces around the world has therefore been done under the cover of liberalism, as if it were spreading freedom and democracy. In order to break, then, with this dominant ideological concept of fascism and restore its theoretical use value, it is helpful to distinguish between, it's helpful to clarify the precise historical relationship between fascism and liberalism. The next section is entitled Liberalism and Fascism, Partners in Capitalist Crime. The dominant bourgeois concept of fascism presents it as the opposite of liberalism. And it also defines the very essence of the fight against fascism as the struggle for liberalism. Now, some of this makes sense insofar as liberal modes of governance tend to protect democratic rights for at least certain segments of the population. And I think particularly in a moment like the moment that we're in, the defense of liberal democratic rights is absolutely 100% necessary. That said, the idea that liberalism and fascism would be in fundamental opposition to one another misses something absolutely essential. And that is that fascism and liberalism are both forms of political management of capitalism. The oft-cited exemplary cases of Italy and Germany that I was talking about a moment ago are highly revealing in this regard. In Italy, in October of 1922, magnates in the Confederation of Industry, so some of the richest capitalists in Italy, provided Mussolini with millions in order to organize his march on Rome as a spectacular show of force. Fascism rises through the support of the capitalist ruling class. It is what you would call astroturf, right? Grassroots movements come organically from below. Astroturfing is a term for when you create the illusion that things come from below by parachuting finances from above. Fascism, as far as I know, at least all of the movements that I've studied are astroturfed movements. Italy is a great example of it. But what's interesting is Mussolini did not seize power. He had the capitalist class behind him. He'd done the March on Rome. He could have immediately declared a dictatorship. He didn't do that. Instead, he insisted on having elections and running a common slate in the elections with the liberals. The fascists had only 35 seats in parliament, but thanks to the common slate with the liberals, they gained 280 seats, 286 seats in the parliament. This same basic pattern of ruling class financial backing and liberal complicity, right? We have to keep both of those things in mind. Ruling class backing and liberal complicity. This same pattern was visible in Germany. In a speech on October 19, 1935, Hitler reminisced on what it meant to have the material resources necessary to support 1,000 Nazi orators with their own cars who could hold some 100,000 public meetings in the course of a year. And this money was the industrialists in Germany, as well as actually US foreign direct investment under the Nazis rose extensively. And many US capitalists invested very directly in Hitler. Ford is the most famous, but there are many, many others. Prior to the election, the Communist Party candidate Ernst Thälmann had argued that a vote for the conservative Field Marshal von Hindenburg amounted to a vote for Hitler and for war. Only weeks after Hindenburg's election, he invited Hitler to become chancellor. So Hitler became chancellor via an election and then an appointment. Fascism in both cases came to power through bourgeois parliamentary democracy, in which big capital bankrolled the candidates who would do its bidding while also creating a populist spectacle, false revolution, that marshaled or suggested mass appeal. Once its power was consolidated, it unflinchingly set about, and the rhythm was different, right? In Italy, it was very slow, the change. In Germany, they hit the gas pedal very quickly. But in both cases, they crushed organized labor, eradicated opposition parties, destroyed independent publications, put a halt to elections, scapegoated and eliminated racialized underclasses, privatized public assets, launched projects of colonial expansion, and invested heavily in a war economy beneficial to its industrial supporters. So capitalist states with bourgeois democracies at the time refused to form an anti-fascist coalition with the Soviet Union, a country that 14 of them had invaded and occupied from 1918 to 1920 in a failed attempt to destroy the world's first workers' republic. During the Spanish Civil War, Western liberal democracies did not officially support the left-leaning government that had been elected. Franco, of course, who was the fascist who was opposed to the left-wing government that had come to power through elections, is, according to his own words, a fascist. He has a number of articles where he explains that he is himself a fascist. In 1934, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy signed the Munich Agreement, in which they agreed to allow Hitler to invade and colonize the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Indeed, it was the fear of being left to confront Hitler alone that eventually drove Stalin, since 1934, the unswerving champion of an alliance with the West against Hitler, into the Stalin-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, by which he hoped to keep the USSR out of the war. This non-aggression pact was then disingenuously presented in the Western media as an undeniable indication that the Nazis and communists were somehow allies. There's been a study that was done that's quite interesting that showed that if that pact hadn't been signed, the non-aggression pact, it bought time for the Soviet Union to build up its productive forces and its war capacity. And if they hadn't done that, then there's a much stronger possibility that the Soviets would have lost the war against the Nazis. And if the Nazis had won against the Soviet Union, then we'd be, speaking German in France now. I mean, it would be a very, very different world. And that's the tip of the iceberg. There'll be a lot more. The German Nazis killed, according to some statistics, 6 million people in gas chambers. They had plans to kill 60 million in the East. They were going to genocidally eliminate the socialist alternative of the Soviet Union. That was the plan. Hitler spelled it out, and Stalin knew it was coming, and he had to buy time in order to defend the people against fascist onslaught. So liberalism and fascism are best understood as capitalist modes of political management. The former rules primarily by consent, and the latter principally by repression. But they often work in tandem with one another. Liberalism, we might say, is the good cop of capitalism, and fascism is the bad cop. They both work together to ensure capitalist dominion. And this metaphor is important because, of course, if you have a choice between a good cop and a bad cop, it's much better to be working with somebody who's going to bring you coffee, let you make a phone call, try to cozy up to you, than somebody who's going to be, getting a sledgehammer out and torturing you. So there should be no kind of ultra-leftist perversion of the argument that I'm making. They work in tandem with one another to manage a capitalist society. But if we have to choose between the two, we have a much better chance working with the liberal good cop than the fascist bad cop. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to jump over a few things that I'd be happy to discuss in the Q&A if I'm okay on time, and change gears a little bit, because what I'm interested in sharing with you, and this is all ongoing research, is how then to draw on this kind of conceptual mapping of fascism to understand the current moment, and more specifically, the incoming Trump administration. So the Trump administration will not and has not changed the fundamental orientation of US foreign policy in any deep manner, and I'll get to some of the details. Having filled his administration with neoconservative war hawks, it is on course to intensify imperialist objectives in West Asia with the Greater Israel Project and the hybrid war on China, as well as progressive states and movements around the world. This imperialist tactic is slightly different than that of the Democrats. The Democrats had focused on the proxy war in the Ukraine against Russia, but the overall strategy of strengthening US-led imperialism is the same, right? The Democrats have been arguing for decades now that, well, we can fight Russia with China in the background more or less at the same time. The Republican, and particularly the Trump orientation, is China's the principal enemy. Let's try to cozy up to Russia, do a kind of Sino-Soviet split, and get Russia at least, somewhat more on our side so that we can fight China principally. It's certainly the case that the Trump administration has worked to present itself as dedicated to global peace, when in fact it is above all devoted to pursuing imperialist hybrid wars while using some different tactics than the Democrats, in part to make it look like they're doing something fundamentally different. The war in the Ukraine was lost by NATO forces. And so when Trump comes in and presents it as if he's making some peace deal, we shouldn't be confused about what's going on. Russia won the war. They're never going to tell you that. They're never going to announce it. The US doesn't lose wars, even though they been losing every war since Vietnam, with only a few exceptions. Grenada in 1983, tiny island country. And many of the wars are very long and very drawn out, but the psychological warfare campaign is very clear: projection of power, never admit defeat. And so a lot of that narrative is just playing into the overall interests of US imperialism. Regarding domestic policy, the United States has historically maintained a bourgeois democracy for certain segments of the population. Of course, from its founding, the indigenous population, the African population, the propertyless population, and women all had inferior statuses of differing degrees, many of them lacking human and political rights, some of them having human rights but no political rights, etc. There is a notorious study that I hope some of you have read from Princeton that demonstrated very clearly that the average citizen within the United States has little to no bearing on public policy, whereas major corporations through their lobbies have a major impact on public policy, basically demonstrating that if you define a democracy by people having power, US people who can vote have no power, therefore you draw the conclusion. I don't think you have to take a sophisticated logic class to arrive at the appropriate conclusion that it's an oligarchic plutocracy, not a democracy. There is also a very powerful police state that makes constant war on the most oppressed and exploited members of the working class, particularly the immigrant population and racialized groups. Victims of this police state, like George Jackson, have described it as fascist in its repression of the working class, and the US has established the largest prison and detention system in the world, not to mention a global system of carceral black sites. So in spite of some tactical disagreements, both the Democrats and the Republicans partake in what I would describe as imperial fascism, meaning the use of fascist death squads, dictatorships, and militias around the world. It's a very well documented history. Just to cite one example, William Bloom, a former member of the State Department who then turned against the State Department, has documented in great detail that there's only one country in the world that has endeavored to overthrow some 50 foreign governments since World War II, the majority of which were democratically elected. Anyone like? Yes. Beginning, yeah. And so in that regard, there's a great quote by Victor Marchetti, who had served in the CIA for about 12 years, I think, maybe 15. And he said, "We support every half-assed dictator, military junta, and death squad around the world. And we do it because it serves our interests, principally our business interests." The other aspect of fascism that both the Democrats and the Republicans agree on is police state fascism, the use of violent state forces to indiscriminately strip people of their human and political rights is integral, unfortunately, to the history of the United States. And of course, we're seeing an uptick in that violence most recently. So if we engage in a refined analysis of the contemporary United States, we also have to recognize that there is still a liberal bourgeois order. Liberal democracy tends to manage the professional managerial class stratum and the upper layers of the working class, as well as acquiescent members of the domestic population. Fascism, though, is unleashed on the non-acquiescent workers of the global South, as well as the racialized and potentially insurgent underclass on the home front. Rather than complete opposites, these modes of governance function as the good cop liberalism and the bad cop fascism of capitalism. What a dialectical analysis, and dialectical is just in this sense, meaning that you look at how these forms of governance are interrelated and interact with one another. What this dialectical mode of analysis demonstrates is that just like the notorious interrogation tactic, the good cop and bad cop, as much as they would like us to believe that they have opposite agendas, right? This is the whole political theater we're constantly subjected to. The Democrats hate the Republicans and the Republicans hate the Democrats, and this is all that we have to focus on. Without the recognition that actually, as Obama said publicly when Trump was first elected, he said, we all play on the same team. That's team capital. In this regard, Trump has been very explicit about intensifying the war on the most oppressed and exploited members of the working class, and this is the material objective behind his racism and misogyny, right? The racism and misogyny are very thin cover for a war on the most oppressed and the most exploited members of the working class, who have always been the racialized groups and women. Always under capitalism, I should qualify that. He seeks to escalate this war on the working class by targeting its lowest tiers. And if you're able to drive down the lowest tiers, you bring wages down for all workers. So it's a war on the entire working class. And we should never think that the war against the most exploited and oppressed members of the working class is somehow good for other members of the working class. It's driving their wages down to force us to work for lower wages. That's the whole gambit. And then the goal is to have us get on board with that project by waging the war against the most oppressed and exploited workers, instead of recognizing that we have common cause with them, because we're all members of the working class. And the ruling class is trying to divide us to better conquer us. This is all packaged by Trump in an ultra-nationalist, religiously inflected ideology of scapegoating, a tactic taken directly out of the playbook of so many fascist demagogues. In a phase of imperialist decline, which is the overriding framework of what's going on, the US empire is in decline. The golden age of US empire building was in the 50s, 60s, the kind of golden age of capitalism. It's well behind us. And the leaders of this country know that full well, and so does the ruling class. It's materially obvious to most people that the United States is not economically as well off as it once was. And the idea of making America great again plugs neatly into a logic of nationalist and religious rejuvenation via racist scapegoating, if it be against the racialized working class, the immigrants in particular, and or against the Chinese as the representatives of a systemic alternative to imperialism. This project has emboldened and empowered fascist organizations in the United States, like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and the Three Percenters. It has also been dedicated to dismantling democratic rights, this is the Trump administration, and increasingly making the bourgeois legal state into a gangster capitalist state run by robber barons. Indeed, Trump already worked with reactionary elements of the state and fascist militias, while backed, as always, by the most reactionary elements of the capitalist ruling class and finance capital in particular, to try and overturn the last election. He's also on record repeating that 2024 was the last election. What a dialectical analysis of fascism reveals is that it is a process of socio-political management that comes in different degrees. And our analysis needs to be fine-grained enough that it is attentive to all of the dimensions of governance. It is true that there is not, at this point, an open fascist dictatorship in the United States. And that's a very good thing. I think we can all agree, hopefully. I don't know if there's any naysayers in here. Anyone who's serious about practical politics should defend liberal rights and democratic rule over their fascist annihilation. The reason for criticizing liberal democracy, as Domenico Lasordo and others have trenchantly argued, is not to abolish it, but rather to transform its false universalism, right? Liberalism says we're all free and equal, but we find out that we're actually not. We want to translate that false universalism into a true universalism. That is the goal. It's also the case that the ideological bedrock of the United States is that it's an anti-fascist democratic country intent on spreading freedom and democracy. Although this is patently untrue in many ways, there's nonetheless a powerful historical narrative and institutions that have been established along these lines. Changing this takes time. The current administration is arresting, detaining, and deporting immigrants and activists without respecting due process and basic democratic rights. It's obviously testing the waters to see how far it can get. And there is every reason to think that these activities will expand. However, it is not, or has not, disappeared some 30,000 people as the Argentine dictatorship, backed by the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States, did in Latin America. It's not running mass extermination camps like the Nazis did, right? So we have to be able to see that fascism as a process is not an all or nothing phenomenon. In French, they talk about fascisation. So it's a process of It sounds awkward in English. Fascistization, the becoming fascist. That's what's going on. Although Trump attempted to undermine the last election, he didn't succeed. And he has not, at least yet, been able to completely transform the bourgeois state into an open dictatorship. Fascism needs to be understood as a process with different degrees of intensification. The version we are currently exposed to is a lower grade than the examples of Argentina and the Nazis that I just cited, but it nonetheless shares the same fundamental orientation: anti-communist, pro-imperialist, and reactionary. What the Trump administration represents then is an ongoing intensification of imperial and police state fascism, combined with an open war on democratic rights, a rolling back of the bourgeois rule of law, and an effort to embolden para-state fascist forces. 1,600 people convicted of seditious conspiracy were let out of prison by Trump. The degree of fascistization, sorry for the awkward formulation, will depend on class struggle, as well as on the overall economic and geopolitical situation. The US's imperial decline and the rise of China as the shepherd of a multipolar world is the overall context within which the capitalist ruling class invested in Trump in order to try and rejuvenate their super profits and halt China. That's the goal. It is unlikely, for many reasons, that he will succeed in this task, though he will certainly engage in more drastic measures. This lack of success will lead, however, as it already has, to an intensification of the class war on workers in the United States. When colonialism meets limits abroad, it brings it to the home front. That, I think, is a very well-established historical front. When US-led imperialism cannot get super profits by subjugating workers in the colonial periphery, it brings that war on workers much more intensely to the home front. As its imperial dominion declines, the repressive tactics used around the world will increasingly be used on its own population to maintain capitalist super profits by any means necessary. When imperialism doesn't succeed abroad, this is what I just said, then violent tactics are brought to bear on its local population. We already see in this war on the most exploited and oppressed members of the working class, the immigrant population. The point of this war is not to eliminate the immigrant working class, but rather to make their conditions so difficult that they're willing to work for less. The US economy depends on immigrant labor. They don't want to get rid of them. They'll never say that publicly, but the economy depends on them. But they want to drive wages down for all workers, and they also are waging a war on consumers. The tariffs are that. Who pays for the tariffs? We pay for the tariffs. It's a war on consumers. So every time you hear the percentages, think, well, next time I go and buy X, Y, or Z, I'm going to be paying more. And where's that money go? To a gangster capitalist state captured by the most reactionary elements of the financial ruling class who want to squeeze us that much more. One unique feature of the United States is that the organized anti-capitalist left has been decimated from years of war. The so-called left has been effectively redefined as a pro-capitalist and pro-imperialist left. Although there's a fringe moment of parties and organizations representing a socialist alternative to the capitalist mainstream, these have much less power and weight than in most capitalist countries, including others in the imperial core. The very culture of leftism has been largely, although not completely, destroyed in the United States. This is one of the important organizing tasks in the leading imperialist country. We need to develop institutions, organizations, networks, media, and educational platforms necessary to sustain the development of a real anti-capitalist culture. Another characteristic of the United States is that its working class, as part of the labor aristocracy, meaning a working class that is at the very top of international pyramids of labor, has been notoriously conservative and anti-communist. Both its position in global value chains, so the fact that it's at the top of the pyramid, and its indoctrination by imperial culture industries have made it loath to oppose imperialism and support the socialist struggle against it. Rather than a revolutionary or proto-revolutionary working class, the US government is facing a working class that has been largely domesticated, particularly when compared to the high points of labor struggles in the history of the United States or internationally. Nevertheless, there's a very insurgent labor movement that is arguably gaining strength, and the current state of the world is radicalizing an increasing number of people. I just have a few minutes left. I don't know how we're doing for time. Yeah, I'm getting very close and can wrap it up quickly. So the way I see the current state of the world is that the contradictions of global class struggle between the imperialist forces and the anti-imperialist forces are sharpening. And the war on the domestic working class is intensifying. So it's very likely that more people are going to come to question the viability of the system they live in. We're also facing a world where capitalist-driven climate change is eliminating the conditions of possibility of human existence. It's code red for humanity. According to the United Nations, there could be no more Homo sapiens in 50 years. So the state of class struggle, the state for the struggle of the nature of the world that we want has never been higher. It's an existential struggle for life. What that means is a lot more people are going to get radicalized because they're going to recognize that former generations didn't do the hard work necessary to move the world in the direction that we need. This is one of the reasons why the war on journalism and education is so central to the current administration. As class struggle intensifies on the home front, due to the violence of imperialism in decline, as well as the patent fact that the capitalist-driven destruction of the biosphere is rendering life impossible, or will soon, more people are going to be pushed into questioning the dominant system. Misdirecting their frustrations will be absolutely central to the maintenance of the system. They have to destroy education. They have to destroy journalism. They can't deal with an informed public that's getting radicalized due to the state of the world. They need the stultification of the US public because it's a bedrock element of the way they rule. William Casey, head of the Central Intelligence Agency under Ronald Reagan, when asked to describe the role of his agency, the CIA, said the following: "We will know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." That's the agenda. The long-standing project of rendering the US-American population ignorant is also a very important factor in analyzing the state of contemporary fascism. Given, unfortunately, how uneducated the general public is, which is due to no fault of its own, but because of the disinformation industries operative in schools and the media and the war on education and journalism, as well as the overworking of the population, right? People working 3 jobs don't have as much time to educate themselves or be educated. So we're dealing with a situation in which the general public isn't as informed as it could otherwise be, and such a population is much more malleable to ruling class agendas. So I'm going to just jump to the conclusion. So in conclusion then, I'd like to address, well, no, actually, I'm going to leave, I think, the rest of this to, I can get to this in the Q&A or it will come up. I guess maybe I'll just say one final thing in conclusion, and that is that although this talk hasn't been as gay and happy as hopefully my opening comments were about how happy I am to be back in Kansas, there is something that is really important and worthy of excitement. And that is that if you think in a distinction between subjective experience, like my experience as an individual, we are living in a world where if you're not a member of the ruling class, and I assume that most people here are not, meaning, you know, I think it's 4 or 5 US Americans who own the equivalent of what 50% of the entire population owns, right? These are people who are super rich, and that wealth comes from the immiseration of everyone else. Doesn't fall out of the sky. If you're not one of those people, then subjectively and individually, most likely your lives, like my life, are going to get a lot worse. That's the negative. The positive is, if you look at global history, what we're living through is the decline of the US empire. The US is not as powerful economically, militarily, culturally, etc., as it once was. This creates an incredible, incredible opportunity. An opportunity to break the imperial stranglehold that the United States has operated on, around the world in order to not just liberate ourselves, but also those in the global South who have been under the jackboot of US imperialism. And so sometimes you have to make subjective sacrifices for the overall gain of humanity. And the objective course, hopefully, of history, which will depend on us and what we do, but we can contribute to a world in which people are given power instead of the reactionary ruling class that is trying to divide, conquer, and ultimately destroy all of us and the planet in due course. So I was trying to be optimistic, but I think I added on a kind of negative note there. Hopefully someone has a little levity to bring to the Q&A. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to
Next, we have the Q&A. Yeah, turn that on. Emma, could you grab that mic real quick? Just turn it on. The way this will work is you can walk up to the front, stand in line for the microphones. I'll pick from one from each side, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. Let's be clear, ask one question. Try not to give a large preface. I know many of us have lots of thoughts in our heads, but maybe we can save them for conversation later. To do as best you can, come up with your question, have it prepared. We'd love to hear what you have to say. So go ahead and line up quickly, and then I will call on you in just a moment. We'll start over here on the right.
Hello. My name is Chris, and I just wanted to ask real quickly. Earlier, you mentioned how Russia had already won the war in Ukraine. Could you please talk more about that and why you claim that to be the case?
Should we take one question at a time, or?
Yes, one question at a time.
Yeah. Well, I think it's I'm not a military analyst, but the best military analysts that I've read and listened to all agree that what occurred in, or has been occurring in the Ukraine, is it began in 2014 as a US-backed fascist coup d'etat against a democratically elected leader. And the eastern regions of Ukraine seceded because they said, we don't want to be part of a fascist-controlled country. And then Ukraine, with US backing, began waging a war on the Russian separatist movement in the east. In doing that, they killed 14,000 people between 2014 and the beginning of the Russian military special operation. That's the broader context, which I think is very important to understand. And what Russia has claimed is that they wanted to support the separatist movement and denazify Ukraine. They have not unleashed the full force of their military. The Russian military is an awesome force to be dealt with. And they have technologies that surpass, like the hypersonic missiles, surpass what the United States has. And what they have done is they've consolidated control of eastern Ukraine. And they're now in a situation where in the negotiations, as far as I can tell, most, if not all of the cards are in their hands. And in that sense, they've attained their principal objectives. And I don't think their objective was ever to take over all of Ukraine. Their objective was to have a land bridge to Crimea and to annex the Russian separatist regions of eastern Ukraine. This might lead to a further debate, but yeah.
Thank you for your question. We'll go on that side of the room.
Okay. So you sort of laid out your definition of what fascism is a little bit earlier. In your opinion, was the Roman Empire and subsequently the Byzantine Empire fascist by your definition?
That's an interesting question, because I do think that in understanding fascism, you can look at the way in which what fascism principally does is it's when the reactionary elements of the capitalist ruling class astroturf parastate forces, so militias and things like this, in order to push an anti-worker agenda and in doing that, rejuvenate the super profits that they want. And that practice, I think, has been systemic to a lot of what's happened under 20th century capitalism, but it continues a tradition that you see earlier in the colonial escapades of the capitalist countries. So if you take that definition and you compare it, for instance, to what the Ohio militia was doing in running scalping campaigns, where there were militias supported by the ruling class and the US government who were paid to scalp the indigenous population in Ohio, this looks a lot like fascism. It just, the concept wasn't around, the term wasn't used, but the colonial violence is in deep continuity with fascism. M.A. Césaire has written poignantly on this. Now, then to compare that to earlier manifestations like the Roman or Byzantine empires, it's an interesting question because I do think that under class societies, there are regularly forms of extremely violent and repressive rule that have been mobilized. I don't know for certain if you could, in a coherent manner, apply the category of fascism, at least in the sense that with the Romans, from what I understand, the Byzantine Empire I know less, these were conscripted soldiers or soldiers who were forced to fight. I'm not familiar with a kind of external funding of parastate forces, meaning not members of the military. Parastate is just parallel to the state, right? So the Ku Klux Klan is a parastate organization. There are many members of the police and the FBI in the Ku Klux Klan, but when they had their hoods on, they were parastate, if you will. And so in that sense, it seems like our concept might get a little sloppy, if you will. Does that help?
Thank you for your question. Go ahead.
So at the end of your talk, you kind of mentioned a bit of like a spark of positivity. The idea that like we may be seeing essentially the death struggle of the American empire. I wanted you to kind of sorry, brain. Could you discuss a little bit what you kind of hope that will look like in moving towards a more free society, and maybe what that free society you hope would look like?
Yeah. It's a little difficult to channel those images right now, I'll admit, but the best elements, I think, of worker struggles in the United States have demonstrated is that when people work together across races, across genders, across sexualities, even across class strata, because the working class is stratified, and they come together as a unified force, they can exercise an incredible amount of power. And if that power is well organized and focused, then it can shift power in the direction of a more egalitarian society, and egalitarian in two senses, both politically, so that everyone has equal rights, political rights and human rights, but also economically, egalitarian not in the sense that you're going to level everything out, everything's going to be the same, but so you don't have the massive discrepancies of wealth that we have in this country, which are absolutely disgusting, because wealth is relational. The reason you have rich people is because you have poor people. And the reason you have richer people is because the poor get poorer. It's relationally constituted. And so what I would hope for is a resolutely unified, transracial, working class movement that pushes in the direction of economic equality, political equality, and the other major factor is what's driving climate change is a capitalist system that maximizes profit over people and the planet. And that has to be stopped. So how we get there is a whole nother question. But I'm absolutely certain that you need organization, power, and unity of purpose. Does that help?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. Go ahead.
I actually don't have a question. I just wanted to
We
personally
can
thank
chat.
you for coming back to Kansas, one hayseed to another. I know there's been some darker notes with this, but it's kind of contrary to that. It's actually been deeply reassuring, or maybe almost to the point of confirmation bias, as somebody who, even as he's woefully uneducated in these matters and is trying to play catch up, to have a speaker that can alleviate some of the stress of thinking that, I might be alone in this thinking. Obviously, a room full of people helps with that reassurance as well. So I wanted to thank you again for coming back to K-State.
Well, thank you. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. And it's also true that I feel alone at times. And the building of community, connecting with people, connecting to their humanity, and seeing that at the end of the day, if we're going to improve this, it's not because I'm going to give a good lecture. Hopefully it was good. I don't want to, not that narcissistic or something. Or writing something important or having one conversation. It's because we're all going to work together, and you're going to make your contribution and you'll make yours, and we'll all find common purpose. And the other thing that I would say is that one of the reasons that for me, the work that I've been doing is focused on the political situation is because coming from Kansas too, I grew up doing a lot of farm work, doing a lot of construction work. And my first intellectual inclinations were, I wanted to understand why exploitation existed. I wanted to understand why alienation existed. And I also wanted to understand why my mother's life was so unhappy, because she's an intellectual who wasn't allowed to go to college because they saved money for the son to go to college. And she didn't have a working day that ended because she was taking care of us, and the working day for women in the way in which society is structured, at least in traditional families, is never over. So at the end of the day, the struggle against exploitation, alienation, and the super exploitation of racialized groups and women is the, I think, most important struggle. So if we can find common cause on that and give ourselves a theoretical framing to allow us to move on those things, then I think really great things not only can be done, but they have been done, right? They have been done. You look at history, why are there women in the university? Why are there people of color in the university? It's because people fought for that, and they fought and they won, and we're on their coattails. But it's now also our turn to step up. So I appreciate really the active solidarity and community building.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Persephone. I'm from the Kansas Socialist Book Club, and I just wanted to reiterate Peter's comments that, we appreciate you shouting out educational, grassroots institutes and love your message, but in the communist spirit of criticism to improve ideas, one of the things that you mentioned during your speech that I'd like some more maybe clarification on was when you made the comment regarding liberalism and how what we should seek out of it is not to promote it or antagonize it to undermine capitalism, but to kind of universalize the values that liberalism claims to have, like universal enfranchisement and so on. I was just wondering, what would you say to the examples of, for example, the CPI, Communist Party of Italy, the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party? Because at least to me, I might be misunderstanding, but it seems like they were very much tried to do what you said that was kind of the approach they took. And in both cases, history demonstrably proves that and demonstrates that their methods were not successful. So I was just wondering, what would you kind of respond to that criticism with? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I thrive on criticism. I mean, I had a very, or still have, a very domineering authoritarian father. And so I always had to try to prove him wrong about everything. And so that was one of the ways I cut my teeth and became hopefully a better intellectual. The CPI, you mean the original CPI that Gramsci and Togliatti were part of?
Yes.
Okay. Because the history of the CPI and the SPD are quite different, because the CPI was in the Third International and was a revolutionary socialist organization. The SPD is a social democratic party in the sense that they believed that you could reform your way out of capitalism. And they advocated, at least originally, for a kind of evolutionary form of socialism. And at one level, historically, this made sense. Like in the early 20th century, it made sense to think, well, if you have democracy and most people are workers, and under monopoly capitalism, there are fewer and fewer people with more money and more workers, you can just vote them out of power. But, and I think this is your point, that's never happened. Well, I shouldn't say that quite. There are a few exceptions to this. But in general, what Marx said in the 19th century, I think still holds true. The ruling class will never let itself be voted out of power. And so I do think there's a distinction. I take it maybe this is where you're headed in your question to get to the meat of it, is that there are certain tactics that are social democratic that consist in saying, well, what we have to do is organize for the ballot box and focus on voting, and that's how we're going to change the system. There's another form of socialism that's revolutionary socialism that says, I mean, there's different versions of this, but one version, like the CPI version, is yes, we participate in elections, we build power by operating in elections, we have public platforms, we take strong positions. But at the end of the day, we know that the ruling class is never going to allow itself to be voted out of power. So we also identify the need at certain points in time when the power dynamic is right to seize state power. And that's a different position. The revolutionary socialists have been the ones who, at least historically, across the global South, have been quite successful in building socialist states. My defense of liberal democratic rights was not a defense of a social democratic position in the full-blown sense of that term. Instead, what I'm advocating for is that when liberal bourgeois rights were introduced, this was a class compromise. So at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, when you had a series of bourgeois revolutions, these were revolutions driven by the working class. France is a great example of it. They were driven by the working class, but then the mercantile class, the emergent capitalist class that wanted to get rid of the old ruling class, the aristocracy, the landed gentry, the people who owned all the land, they wanted to get rid of them. And so they allied with the working class, but they wanted to make sure that they captured the revolution in such a way that they limited its gains. They didn't want a worker state. They didn't want a revolutionary overthrow of class society in general. They wanted to be the new ruling class. And so bourgeois democracies were a class compromise. We'll set up a system of government where the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, discreetly controls the elections, the state system, et cetera, but will guarantee rights for workers, et cetera. That system is rigged from the inside because it presupposes that the ruling class will actually recognize and respect the rights of the workers, but anytime the workers get really organized and really radical, those rights disappear. So in that sense, we have to recognize it for what it is. And when I say universalize those rights, the rights on paper sound great. All people are free, all people are equal, like there's wonderful statements. But the problem is reality isn't what's on paper. And to make it a reality, you need a state that's in the hands of the people, not a state that's in the hands of the ruling class. And the people who have demonstrated how to get there are, for the most part, those of the global South who have been able to get state power to do it. If you don't have state power, they'll crush you. That, I think, is very clear historically. So, sorry, that was a little bit long-winded, but it was a really rich question, and I appreciate the pushback.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great speech, by the way.
Thank you for your question.
All right, thank you. I just want to say I really enjoyed the talk. I'll definitely be going back to the recording a bunch in the future to, look over it again. My question, I guess I'll go over some really short context. In Black Shirts and Reds, Dr. Michael Parenti describes fascism as almost an immune response to the growing kind of more mature leftist and socialist movements in these especially Western industrialized countries. And then kind of extending onto that, you mentioned in your speech that kind of leftist movement has been crushed in the US largely, especially with co-option and COINTELPRO. Now, kind of extending off of that, there's this really great paper from Dr. Germa Bell, who's a Spanish economist, called Against the Mainstream, Privatization in Nazi Germany. And he does a quantitative analysis where he finds that the neoliberal reforms in the 80s privatized to a far greater extent than even the Nazis did when it comes to capital accumulation privatization. So I guess the question is, without a strong leftist force in the US, and with the capitalist class getting basically everything they could want from neoliberalism, I mean, they had the largest amount of accumulation since Reagan over the COVID years, why would the capitalist class now be moving to a more maybe unstable system by backing fascism and Trump when they've already got everything they want now?
Great question. And I wish I don't know how old you are, but I'm guessing slightly younger than me. And I
I'm
wish,
school.
what's that?
High school.
You're in high school.
Yeah, I was in.
Oh, wow. Okay. I wish I was that smart at your age because you're unbelievably well-spoken and you're reading Michael Parenti. Like everybody should just leave the lecture now and go black shirts and reds, and maybe you'll get as smart as this young gentleman. Very, very impressive. The question is really spot on, and I'd like to, if you could share the Against the Mainstream essay with me, I'd love to read it, the link or a PDF, because I'm not familiar with that. But I think the question can be addressed by looking at what's happened under neoliberalism. So this will just take a sec, but very quickly, the neoliberal bet was that, when the US became the leading imperial power at the end of World War II, between the mid-40s and the end of the 70s, you actually had socialism expanding globally. You had it expanding in the Far East. You had it come to Cuba in 1959. You had Nicaragua. You had the capitalist world was on its heels. And so the neoliberal solution was, how can we break this model of expanding socialism? And how can we reinvigorate our capitalist super profits? And one of the main decisions that was made was to offshore production and financialize the economy. In offshoring the production, then they shifted so much of the productive sites elsewhere, Latin America, Southeast Asia, et cetera. And now the United States has almost fully financialized its economy, right? Like, what do we make? We make bombs and we make movies about why it's great to drop bombs. And other than that, there's some pharmaceuticals and things like that. But for the most part, the productive economy is not here, and they're not bringing it back. They are not bringing it back. They have no strategic plan to bring it back. This is all a lie. In that regard, though, neoliberalism has exhausted itself. And it's largely exhausted itself because a financial economy can't survive without a productive base. At the end of the day, for the world to work, we need goods and services. We need like highways and bridges that don't collapse and buildings that don't burn down and things like this. And the productive economy being offshored has created a situation where you don't have a productive base in the economy. The US GDP rates, if you look at them.
10 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, then the long and short of this is look at the growth of the Chinese economy since 1949, and particularly since the early 80s, and compare them to the United States. China's been growing at 10% a year. The US last year was what, 2.8%? It would love to do 5%. The Chinese economy decided to slow down to 5% to introduce an environmental civilization. That is the principal problem, is that China is the largest economy in the world according to purchasing power parity, and is on course to surpass, in pure terms, GDP terms, the US economy by 2030. If that happens, which it looks like it will happen, that means that there's a new dominant world order that is largely overseen by China and a multipolar world, and imperialism goes back on its heels. That has to be halted. And so I think the principal global conflict is that between the US model and the Chinese alternative. Sorry, there's probably more, but I have the professorial problem of going on at length. So we can continue the conversation hopefully a bit later.
Thank you. I just wanted to say for YDSA members, you might want to let other questions be asked. We'll have more time with Dr. Rockhill later. Awesome.
I can speed up too.
No.
Sorry. They're just really great questions.
I
get these
I can't,
before. It's
I
like
don't disagree.
brilliant high schoolers are reading Michael Parenti. Like, I had no idea that I was coming into this crowd.
Kansas, yeah, I know.
Yeah, I know, it's Kansas, that's right.
Go ahead.
Once again, thank you for your talk and your speech. It was highly informative. And following those two questions, this might sound a little simplistic, but I was highly fascinated with the concept of astroturfing. I was wondering if you could give some really like small, maybe less known examples and how they were able to materialize and kind of fly under the radar, if that was possible. Thank you.
Does anyone know the 1934 business coup? Is this common knowledge? Maybe one person from the communist reading group? Is that? Any other weirdos in the room? No, I'm kidding. Other than you and me, right? There's solidarity here in the weirdo camp. Because the 1934 business coup should be part of common knowledge because it's a great example of astroturfing. The capitalist ruling class in this country, the Morgan interests, the DuPont interests, some of the most powerful elements of the capitalist ruling class decided that the New Deal under FDR was giving too much to the working class. And so what they needed is a fascist-style coup d'etat. They sent an individual to Europe to study 4 different models of fascism. They came back and decided that the model in France was the best possible model to apply to the United States. They honeypotted veterans who were trying to get a bonus that they were due from their service. And they armed them because the DuPont family had a controlling interest in Remington Arms. And they were planning a march on Washington, and they'd identified a man on a white horse by the name of Smedley Butler, who they were going to put forth as the fascist leader of the country. And the plan was not only completely exposed, but Smedley Butler publicly admitted to it because he went against it. And there was great work by a journalist by the name of Spivak, who released all of this internal information, and they were clear. It was a fascist dictatorship, and it was astroturfed. So that would be one very good example. The Stop the Steal rally was also astroturfed, right? This was by the public supermarket interests, right? Who paid so much money to astroturf that movement. The Tea Party movement is totally astroturfed. Yeah, they have to create this stuff. And they also control the televisual apparatus. And so you can actually, with very small movements, make it look as if it's enormous by the way in which you present things. So those are some quick examples.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Hi, I'll just go as quick as I can. It's kind of low. You're from Kansas. I'm from Kansas. And when I say I'm from Kansas, I mean my family settled here before the Civil War. So I've lived here for a long time. And
Are you that old?
and then part of my family is from England, and they have some socialist roots that have kind of been forgotten, unfortunately, because my great-grandfather died in a coal mining accident in his 20s. But anyway, I just wanted to know your thoughts on Kansas, because I've lived in Kansas my entire life, and obviously all of my family has for many generations. And I've lived here for 10 years, and I'm a K-State alumni. I know all of the organizations that do any kind of political action here, not as much as the Republican stuff. That's kind of, I can go on because it's very fascinating between all the different relationships. And I've seen many different movements here, like the Black Lives Movement. I've seen, when they were trying to ban abortion, and I've kind of been able to observe how these movements are created and how they evolve, and then the ultimate conclusion. And I do see a lot of resemblance in what you say, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement. We've had one of the largest protests in the history of Manhattan in here. And the result of that was a street was changed to Martin Luther King Jr. And we've got a larger police budget, but at least one of the organizers was appointed to the law board. So,
Yeah.
But anyway, since you're from Kansas, was just wondering if you've had observed anything in Kansas at all and have any kind of opinion on the kind of culture here and political movements. And I've also, I'm kind of curious because I don't think a lot of people mention the religious aspect.
Yeah,
and
big.
my family, I was raised Christian, and it's such a profound influence on how people interact, or how they make the choice to do things. And Karl Marx said that religion is the opium to the masses, and it's pretty clear. So anyway,
Yeah.
what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Karl Marx also said that religion is the cry of the oppressed, right? So he also understood that people who are desperate, who are looking for a better world, will latch onto whatever dominant models there are. And so I think he also had that kind of dual perspective. I left Kansas a long time ago and come back to visit family, and now hopefully will become an integral member of K-State's broader community and come back regularly because I've really enjoyed this conversation. But I don't really know the kind of contemporary organizing scene. I know what it was like years ago. I went to a very rural high school, very right-wing, very racist, very misogynist. Football was the religion, and that kind of world it's difficult to organize in, but at the same time, even when I was in high school, of course, not as brilliant as the man in the back of the room, but I was involved in trying to change things politically. And one thing that I really remember very clearly is the sense that people have an understanding of injustice. They have an understanding of exploitation. They're human beings, after all, whose parents are being crushed by the system, and connecting to their humanity is so essential because then you can bring that out as a kind of rallying point. At the same time, a lot of my family now lives in Lawrence, which of course is this little bubble of kind of liberals. And that's a very different world. We were having an interesting conversation earlier, though, about prior to the talk, about how important places like Kansas are. Because at the end of the day, you have a part of the country that is dominated by right-wing forces, but also a part of the country that has been enormously abused and crushed by the people in Washington and by the governments within Kansas itself. And so a lot of more radical movements in history, I mean, we're in the land of John Brown, right? I mean, there's some really, really radical legacies in the struggle for a free state. And in the history of the United States, you know, it's not just Kansas, it's places like Appalachia. Like, you should, I think, very keenly identify with the most radical elements of your region or our region. But then the last thing that I would say is that I really appreciate the question, because in addressing the issue of how to move, I can't remember who asked the question earlier, like, what society do we want and how are we going to get there? And to get there, you can't do it based on what you want. And you can't do it just on what you think, you know, is smart because you read a book or because you watched a TV show or somebody else is doing something. You have to work with the people who are there. And so there's a great orientation called the mass line. The mass line is, right, okay, hey, we're us again. So the mass line is, it's all about, you got to learn where people are at. And if they're in Christianity, if they are conservative, they might have reasons for being conservative, right? And they might have very justified ones. I know a lot of Republicans who say the government's screwing us over. I'm like, yeah, they are. The fat cats are screwing us over. Yeah, they are. The news is lying to us. Yeah. Those conservatives, they understand a lot about what's going on. Life is getting worse and harder. Yeah, that's all right. But then you got to take that understanding and you frame it in a broader manner so that one can see the class struggle and the forces that are operative so that people actually fight against those things rather than fighting for them. Because so many people are miseducated into fighting actually against themselves, right? Probably people know the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? The Tom Frank book.
I met him too.
What's that?
I met him and I asked him if he read Marx and he kind of freaked out.
I mean,
He's like uneasy because it's like, oh, I don't know, I'm not.
Final remarks.
Yeah. The point is that what he points out is that many people in Kansas end up voting against their best interest. So in a nutshell, I think it's you meet people where they're at, listen to their suffering, listen to their needs, but then try to give them tools by which they can really meet those needs and really alleviate that suffering. And so unity, disunity, meaning, hey, you got to understand it from this perspective, and then a higher unity where you bring people in, you're like, yeah, I want to fight against the fat cats. I want to fight against the government that's not serving my purposes. I want to fight against fake news. But the way to do it is not by supporting fascist reactionaries. So on that note, yeah.
Before everyone gets all the way out of here, I just wanted to say once again, thank you, Dr. Rockhill, for having this talk with us. This was enlightening, as clear as the questions demonstrate that people were extremely engaged and that this is an important thing to have, especially on this university campus and at this time. So I wanted to add one last thing is just for any of you in the room who are looking for that, political home, for that place to work and make the world that you want to see, YDSA hopes to be there. We hope to connect you with those organizations. We hope to put on more events like these. So if this was interesting to you at all, please come meet any of our organizers in the shirts with K-State YDSA on them, and please come talk to us. We would love to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you all, and a big thanks to the organizers. They've been fantastic on top of everything, and great hosts. So thank you all.